Good evening. I'm going to request our second speaker for the evening, Kamini Dandapani. Was born and raised, and as she calls it, a once sleepy Madras. She now lives in the city that never sleeps, which is New York. She's had extensive training in Carnatic music, Bharatanatyam, and Western classical music, and a longer than desired stint in the corporate world that included Chase Manhattan Bank and McKinsey and Company, and was followed by a complete change in direction back to her true loves, which is top among which are music and writing. And of course, I've read the book too. I've read both your books, and I think it's a delightful insight into, and we initially thought we'll reorder that, but then we said that it's good because yours ends up in a particular space from where she can actually pick up for Cholas. And Rajaraja Chola was somebody else. So, Kamini.
Thank you, Paul, and the whole Sarmaya team for inviting me to talk here today. It's been an absolute delight getting to know all of you and interacting with all of you, and thank you for coming. So I'm going to take you further south into central Tamil Nadu, the Kaveri River Delta, and take you through 2,000 years of history, actually, because the Cholas were an empire that flourished twice. There was an earlier lot of Cholas and a later lot, and maybe they were related, maybe not, but you will see why I'm telling that story as well. So let us hang on and take a ride through the tempestuous life and times of Rajaraja and the Cholas. And as with any journey, we will start at the beginning and make 4 stops through our journey. The first is we'll talk about the Kaveri River, which was where they established themselves. It's a remarkable river with a lot of history and mythology. So I'll just show you roughly what that was. That was a source of a lot of the wealth of the Cholas. We'll talk about the beautiful Sangam poetry, and also I'll tell you why we are talking about that poetry and the earliest Cholas. We then go to the earliest so-called imperial Cholas, the age of the great Rajaraja Chola, and we'll sprint through the post-Rajaraja world till they come to their end. So that's what I'm going to be covering today. So this is actually a delightful painting that's in the British Library of the Kaveri River near Trichinapalli, which is a bit west of Tanjavur, one of the Chola capitals. You see people bathing in the ghats there, and you see the rock fort temple. So I don't know if you can make this out, but this is a map of the Kaveri River, which has its origins in Karnataka. It flows across and enters Tamil Nadu somewhere there at the Hoganakan Falls. It goes down, there are a bunch of tributaries that join. Here is Tanjavur with the great Brihadishwara temple that was built by Rajaraja Chola. Up there is the Gangekonda Cholapuram temple that was built by Rajaraja's son, and this is the great Kaveri Delta, one of the most beautiful places on earth. You have the green paddy fields rippling through to as far as the eye can see, and that was the major source of the Cholas' wealth. Now, the Kaveri River, as I said, is rich in history, stories, songs, and I thought I'll give you little breaks from the torrent of words that you're going to hear with little snippets of song that kind of bring to life the Chola world. So here's a song, you might recognize some of the words. The Chola kingdom was called Chola Mandalam, and in fact the coast was called the Coromandel Coast, which derives from Chola Mandalam. And you will hear these words in the 2 lines that I'm going to sing just now. ஏழ்தலம் புகழ் காவேரியால் விழை சோழ மண்டலமீதே மனோகர ஏழ்தலம் புகழ் காவேரியால் விழை சோழ மண்டலமீதே மனோகர ராஜகம்பீர நாடாலும் நாயக வயலூர. So we're now going to talk about, thank you, Sangam poetry, and you'll see why I'm going to talk about it. So the Sangams, they say, were academies of poets, and there were a bunch of Sangams. The one that we are talking about is the third Sangam that was from about 100 BCE to 250 CE. And they say the members of these academies, these poetic academies, were gods, sages, kings, men, women, poor people, rich people, and they all wrote poetry that was of an amazing standard, an amazing beauty. And much of the poetry, Sangam poetry that we have today is from the third Sangam. It's beautiful, and I'm going to show you some of these poems in a moment. Rich in metaphor, and they're so relatable, like anybody today, even the youth of today will relate to these poems because they talk about universal emotions like love and longing and in a language that, speaks to our hearts. There are two main genres of Sangam poetry. One is called Agam, which are poems of love, longing, relationships, fights, breakups, that kind of stuff. And then you have the Puram poems, which are called outside poems or exterior poems. These are poems of war, battles, kings, and heroes. And it's from these Puram poems about the kings and stuff that we know about the earlier Cholas and also what life in Chola society was like, in the early Chola society of 2,000 years ago. So here's an example of an Agam or inner poem. And just look at the Tamil is on this side and the English is on that side. And I'm going to sing this for you. Yayum, yayum, yaragiyaro, yentayum, nundayum, yemmurai kelir, yentayum, nundayum, yemmurai kelir, yanum niyo evaliyaredum, செம்புலப்பை நீர் போல அன்புடன் நெஞ்சம்தான் கலந்தனவே கலந்தனவே கலந்தனவே. The English translation is by the great A.K. Ramanujam, and it's so beautiful. And you heard the word Shempulape Neer Pola, that means like red earth and pouring rain. And the poets were called by the metaphors by which they were most popularly known. So this is a lovely one. And next we have a Puram or an outer poem. It says, Great King, you shield your men from ruin, so your victories, your greatness are bywords. Loose chariot wheels lie about the battleground with the long white tusks of bull elephants. Flocks of male eagles eat carrion with their mates. Headless bodies dance about before they fall to the ground. Blood glows like the sky before nightfall in the red center of the battlefield. Demons dance there, and your kingdom is an unfailing harvest of victorious wars. This does not feel like it was written 2,000 years ago. It's really beautiful. So, from these kind of poems that I read about, we know about some of the great Sangam Chola kings of 2,000 years ago. I'll just tell you very briefly about two of them. One was Karikala, and some people believe that that was his name because Karikala in Tamil means the king with a charred leg. And they believe he was in a fire and he was trying to escape from prison and he burnt his leg. Who knows whether that's true or not, but it's one of those urban legends that have grown and stay to this day. Karikala had a very difficult life. His father died before he was born, and he was thrown into prison. And, he kind of clawed his way into becoming a king against many odds, many people trying to kill him and many people trying to steal the kingdom from him. All this is there in the poems of those days. And he was a terror who won many important battles once he actually became king. And apparently he had a prosperous kingdom. And he moved his capital to the coast, to a place called Kaveri Poompattinam, which is today's Poompahar. And you have amazing descriptions of the city from the Sangam poems and other sources from the west, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea and Ptolemy's Geographica, all of which describe a thriving city with lively, bustling markets to which people came from as far as the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. So traders actually came there. Coins have been found from those parts of the world in these places. So it was a very, very, very international world. And those who say that globalization is a new concept just don't know their history. Another famous Sangam Chola king was Kochengannan, which means a king of the red eyes. And, there's a big story between about why he got the red eyes. You can read the book and find that out. And he became a saint at some point. He was canonized in one of the later Shaiva works. So these are two great Sangam Chola kings. But why are we even talking about these kings? And what do they have to do with Rajaraja? Are these kings related to them? We don't know. But at the very least, we do know that they occupied the same area as the later so-called imperial Cholas in the Kaveri Delta. But in the genealogies constructed by Rajaraja and the other Chola kings, Sangam kings like Karikala and Kochengannan are proudly hailed as their ancestors. There are all these legends that came up about their greatness, and they kind of piggybacked off that to say that we are part of this great heritage and lineage, and so they are a part of the Chola story. So mythology, image creation and projection, public relations, they were all a very important part of Chola strategy to legitimize and validate their position. They understood the power of myth and legend to shape perceptions and history. So, it's customary to talk of Cholas as being this great golden age of Tamil culture. And when you think of a golden age, you think of a kingdom that is, functioning like clockwork, everything going smoothly, the roads paved with gold, and it's this big shining thing. The whole thing is a mirage. It's like you see these ducks or swans, floating on a lake. They seem like placid, going stately, in a stately, serene manner on a lake, but underneath there's like desperate paddling going on. This was the Chola world. I mean, the image was not what the reality was, but it was important for them to project themselves as these great things because, it was a very, very, very unstable time and a very unstable empire that they were desperately trying to hold together. And we are coming to Rajaraja, just a little more ground to cover because he didn't come out of nowhere. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of background and context to tell you how Rajaraja came to be. So, there's a lot of debate about the term imperial Cholas, and I'm just using it as a way to set apart this set of Cholas from the earlier Sangam Cholas. I don't know that, this imperial is, I think, a Western notion of an empire and things like that. So who knows? But the scale of their achievement, the depth and breadth of their achievements, maybe you can give it to them, so we do owe them that much. So it's like a cartoon version of what was going on in southern India before the Cholas rose to power. This is a little south of the Deccan that Anirudh was talking about. It was probably the same thing there. It is just a lot of fighting and chaos. And maybe this will make it a little clearer. I doubt it. But it's, you have all the powers that they had to contend with. You had the Rashtrakutas there, the Western Chalukyas, the Eastern Chalukyas. You had the Pallavas. You had the Cholas somewhere in the middle over there. And then you had the chieftains like the Palluvettarayars, the Muttarayars, the Irukavales. Minor dynasties like the Western Gangas, and then you had the Pandyas who were their major enemies. So it was all like one big swirl, okay? The loyalties were changing constantly. And these chieftains that I've mentioned there, they were critical. Their loyalty could make or break, the bigger dynasties. So if you are confused, it's good because you're supposed to be confused. None of this is supposed to make sense. It's hard to package history neatly and, tie a little bow and say, here. It is a mess, and we need to accept that. So 8th and 9th century southern India was highly, highly unstable. You saw all the kind of the empires that were there as part of the milieu. Multiple dynasties, clans, tribes, chieftains were all vying for power and territory. Most were hyper-local. They controlled like little pockets of land that was their domain. And there were some that were slightly bigger, that had larger domains. So you had the Pallavas in northern Tamil Nadu, the Pandyas in southern Tamil Nadu, the Chalukyas, the western and eastern Chalukyas, and the Rashtrakutas in the Deccan. And in between all this, somewhere in the middle, were the Cholas, who were still not a power to reckon with as yet. Now we're talking about the dawn of the Cholas, and you will see through this presentation that I've deliberately used a sort of a solar motive, the sun and the sunrise. That is because the Cholas said that they were part of the solar dynasty, and that they were descendants of the sun. And again, these genealogies that they constructed, full of mythology and, the grand ancestors who were not real at all. So they had these mythological ancestors, semi-historic ancestors, historic, and then finally actual people that were part of their lineage. All that was just to create this image that they came out from this very grand, tradition and heritage. So here's what they had to say. One of the inscriptions, the Tiruvilangadu plates, about their origins from the sun. The eye of the three worlds was the sun, from whom sprang the sprouts of all families of kings. The virtues of the solar race are resplendent beyond number. So now we come to the imperial Chola line, the first of whom was a chieftain called Vijayalaya, who ruled from 850 to 870. As you will see, he came at a time of great instability and fighting. It was a time when loyalties and allegiances were constantly changing. It was me. What can I do best to ensure my survival, to ensure that things are best for me? So if circumstances changed, so did loyalties. Loyalty meant nothing at that time, and there wasn't even a pretense of it. So Vijayalaya was a small-time chieftain of a clan that called itself the Cholas, and in sometime around 850 AD, he won a battle against a rival clan that ruled out of Tanjavur called the Muttarayars. It must have been a fierce battle because later Chola poets claim that he received 96 battle scars. It was a small step for Vijayalaya, a giant leap for the Cholas. Vijayalaya moved his capital to Tanjavur, where he consecrated a temple to the fierce goddess Nishimbhasudani. And there is a little shlokam about her that I will sing just now. Yasa Shumbha Nishumbha Daitya Shamani Ya Rakta Bhijasini Yasa Shumbha Nishumbha Daitya Shamani Ya Rakta Bhijasini. So she was a fierce goddess. If you see a picture of Nishimbhasudani, it's like Kali. She's got these fangs with blood dripping. So it's an ideal goddess for a fledgling empire, right? So she kind of represented what their milieu was like at the time. So what was Vijayalaya's reign? If you think of him as a king and sitting in his court in Darbar and, dancing girls around him and ministers advising him, that was not it at all. So it was just fighting the whole time. And the major powers in the Tamil region there were the Pallavas in the north, around Mamalapuram that Anirudh showed earlier with the sculpture of Shiva and things. And to the south were the Pandyas. And the Muttarayars, who Vijayalaya had just defeated, were feudatories of the Pandyas. And in defeating them, he now marked himself as an enemy of the Pandyas because he defeated the Pandyas' friends. And now Vijayalaya had to find himself a powerful ally, and he chose to ally with the Pallavas. And another way to secure loyalty and alliances was marriage alliances. These poor women were married off to, some dynasty or clan or the other, in the hope that, they'd not launch an attack against their daughter's family. And so that was another way. So they cast their marital net very wide, hoping that that would help out. It didn't. A couple of times it backfired. And Vijayalaya was a small fellow, but he set the ball rolling on the resurgence of the Cholas. Now, the Chola sun has risen. It's climbing higher in the sky. And it was a time of medieval snakes and ladders. It was up and down. For every victory you won, they kind of slid down and lost. It's like you wonder how they went through this, but eventually they made it when Rajaraja comes along. So Vijayalaya, I'll just give you a very brief outline about the history of the Cholas until Rajaraja comes along. He was followed, Vijayalaya, the first so-called imperial Chola, was followed by his son Aditya, who defeated the Pandyas, and he backstabbed his once allies, the Pallavas, who had supported him, and now when he saw that they were in a weak moment, he defeated them. And now the Pallava lands in northern Tamil Nadu came into Chola control. And it was probably the first time that they acquired land that was outside their immediate core area of the Kaveri Delta. So it's the beginning of the expansion of the empire beyond the core. After Vijayalaya came a king called Parantaka, who ruled for 48 years, full of exhilarating victories and devastating defeats. And he captured parts of Pandya lands in the south, and he sent troops into Sri Lanka as well. And after years of fighting, and things were looking good because his inscriptions were found in Pandya lands, and having inscriptions in lands that were not your own was the acid test. That was the only way you knew that they actually perhaps conquered those lands. You can say what you want in your own inscriptions, and you can boast. And there's a lot of boasting and chest thumping that went on. Sometimes you see these inscriptions, both sides will claim to have won the same battle, but the only way you know for sure is if your inscription is found in that place. And even then, it's not a certainty. So he got some control of the Pandya lands, but in the meantime, he faced a terrible disaster in the northern reaches of his empire when Anirudh's Rashtrakutas defeated the Chola. They dealt them a terrible, terrible, terrible defeat. Parantaka's son, who was the heir apparent, who was the Yuvaraja or the crown prince, was killed in a battle called the Battle of Takkolam, and Chola fortunes plummeted after this. And, they had worked so hard to gain ground into the Pallava lands, into Pandya lands, and now with this defeat, all the enemies started rearing their heads again. Poor Parantaka, he died a broken man, the empire he worked so hard to build in complete disarray. And then there followed a period of about 30 years where there's complete anarchy, complete chaos in Chola land, because the inscriptions make no sense at all. You try to piece together a list of kings after that, it makes no sense. There's there's no agreement between different inscriptions. They give different names, different periods of reign. And at this point, the lineage turned patrilateral. That is, instead of from father to son, it turned from brother to another brother. And the Chola line moved to another line, which would eventually be Rajaraja's line. And then it went zigzagged back. Small areas of territory were regained, but the Pandyas remained a major menace, as they always were, and would continue to be through the bitter end. The Rashtrakutas faded from the scene to be replaced by the Chalukyas. In the middle of all this, the crown prince, the one designated for the next king, Chola king Aditya Karikala, was murdered. He was the older brother of Rajaraja. And it is this period that is blown up in the movie and the book Ponniyin Selvan, because it certainly must have been an interesting period. We have no idea what actually happened, so I guess it's ripe for historical fiction. Rajaraja should have become king after his brother was murdered, but it was his uncle who became the king instead. His name was Uttama Chola. And inscriptions are always very rosy, they like to create, again, paint this picture of everything being perfect and everything great, but even in that, you get hints of something, that there's an ominously brewing Kali Yugam, and, so things were clearly more unstable than normal at this time. And this is the time of Rajaraja. So there's a fun song from a movie actually that goes, Rajaraja Chola nan, yenayalum kadal desham nidan. Rajaraja Chola nan, yenayalum kadal desham nidan. Puve kadal tive. So the movie was nothing about Rajaraja, but I thought it was a fun segue into him. So, a little background about Rajaraja. He was born Arul Mori Varman in the year 947. He was the third child of the Emperor Sundara Chola and one of his queens, one of his many queens, Vanaman Mahadevi. Rajaraja's father, Sundara, was a Chola emperor from 957 to 973, and then his cousin became the king and ruled until 985. At this point, the Chola Empire had recovered somewhat after the disastrous Battle of Takkolam, regaining bits and pieces of territory, but the kingdom was still in a very precarious state. There were enemies all around, ready to strike at any hint of weakness. But you read the Chola inscriptions, they talk of great fanfare and signs of greatness when Rajaraja was born. They say Naga queens danced when he was born, and he was born with the, the conch and the wheel, the signs of Vishnu that shows he was destined for greatness. And a lot of was this an exaggeration, because Rajaraja was not born, his brother should have been king, not Rajaraja. So, and was it an exaggeration? Was it prescient? I don't know, but there's a lot of retrofitting going on in Chola inscriptions. You kind of make this person great after the fact. And again, this is all part of their bolstering their image strategy. So here's Rajaraja's passage to the throne. As you saw from the previous, the reigns of the previous emperors, the Chola Empire was in turmoil during his growing up years. And I'd like to wonder, was this the topic of conversation in his household when he was growing up? It must have been interesting to discuss. I'm sure this was discussed in great depth. Rajaraja's grandfather was the king, after which his father Sundara became king. Then his brother Aditya Karikala was murdered. And as I said, this becomes part of the plot of the book and blockbuster movie Ponniyin Selvan. And Rajaraja's uncle was the king. He ruled for 14 years, and then it was time for Rajaraja. Okay, and here's what the inscriptions have to say about his coronation, about his coming, the ceremony for coronation. Arul Mori Varman was then himself installed in the administration of the kingdom, and the ends of the quarters heavily roared with the tumultuous sounds of the war drums, rows of bells and bugles, kettle drums, tambourines, and conches. So now you have Rajaraja crowned king of the Cholas. Rajaraja's military achievements were many. Even if you take his inscriptions with a pinch of salt, as I said, inscriptional evidence does show that he did conquer a good part of the southern peninsular South India. So the inscription says, this king invaded and conquered all the quarters, commencing with the direction of Trishanku, or the south. As we know, Rajaraja inherited a shrunken kingdom that had not recovered from the losses to the Rashtrakutas and the constant fighting with the Pandyas. Threats and danger lurked everywhere. To the north were the Chalukyas, who had replaced the Rashtrakutas and were now gaining ground. To the northwest, the Gangas near and around Mysore had to be subdued. To the south were the Cholas' oldest foes, the Pandyas, and to the west, the Cheras of Kerala, who were aligned with the Pandyas and also controlled the trade routes, the western trade routes on the western side of India. He set to work methodically. So this is what he aimed to conquer. It took a full 8 years before the first inscriptions announcing victory began to appear. So I'll just run through his military victories because they're all just battles. So his first lot were with the Cheras and Pandyas in Kerala. And apparently the impetus for his attacking Kerala was an insult that was meted out to a diplomatic envoy. And I think Rajaraja was not one who would take an insult lightly. So he sent this big this big army out to fight them. It's not sure what exactly the nature of the fight was, but it was a pretty brutal battle based on inscriptions that have been found. And I think he took control of the Chera ports, which control trade to the further west. And then his good old foes, the Pandyas, he conquered some of their territory also, and he kind of rubbed salt in their wound by naming the Pandya lands after himself. So Pandya Mandalam became Rajaraja Mandalam. So I'm sure the Pandyas were furious, and they never ever submitted or accepted being dominated by the Cholas. It was at best what they call a sullen submission. So they were a constant threat throughout the Chola times. And then his campaigns in the Deccan were some of the most brutal you've ever seen. You know, he had a rival in the Chalukyas called Satyasraya, who was also a young, ambitious ruler with a kingdom, on the rise. So the two of them butted heads and butted armies couple of times. Again, you have stories of both sides claiming to have won the same battle, but eventually he prevailed. And then he also, stuck his nose into the Vengi or the Eastern Chalukya dynasty, where there was an interesting situation where the king had died and a rogue king had come in there and taken control, and the sons of the dead king had run away, because they feared for their lives. So Rajaraja took them under his wing, all with strategic intent, and he got his daughter married to one of them, and with their help, he eventually managed to defeat the rogue ruler, and he installed one of the sons as the king. And while he was the king, he was basically a puppet with Rajaraja, controlling what was going on. And when the second brother became king, it was Rajaraja's son-in-law who was now the Vengi king. So they were even drawn even more tightly into the Chola net. And eventually the Vengi dynasty and the Chola dynasty, the Vengis were lunar, the Cholas were solar. They kind of fused together, and a Vengi king became the Chola king much later. That would be Rajaraja's great-grandson. But he did have, I think, a strategic mindset in what he did, and how he did stuff. Here is a victory pillar depicting a battle against the Gangas. This is in Kaliur on the banks of the Kaveri. It's a big mess, but you can see all elephants and people kind of lying dead down here, elephants fleeing the scene, people on horseback. It kind of gives you an idea of all the kind of action that was taking place, and it was not like a neat army that marched in formation. It was more like an Asterix army where they just all kind of, pounced on each other, and it was a free-for-all, basically. Next in line was Sri Lanka, the Emerald Isle, and it was of great interest. Again, there'd been a lot of the Sri Lankans had sided with the Pandyas, and therefore they were the enemies of the Cholas. And Sri Lanka was also rich in copper, and some of its ports were also part of trading routes further west to China. So it was a very attractive territory to conquer. And Sri Lanka was in a very unstable state too. There was a king there who was very weak apparently, and he had these mercenary soldiers who were from Kerala, and they were a very rebellious lot apparently. They were hard to control even in normal times, and with a weak king they rebelled, and they said, we have not been paid our salary, and there was complete chaos and anarchy in the land. And apparently Rajaraja got word from a horse trader that situation in Sri Lanka was, ripe for conquest. So he sent his troops there, and it was again a bloody, brutal battles that took place over there. The city of Anuradhapura, which was the capital, was completely destroyed. It was so decimated that they couldn't use it anymore, and he moved the Chola capital in Sri Lanka to Polonnaruwa. And here's a temple that stands to this day in Polonnaruwa, built by Rajaraja. It's a small little temple, but it's apparently very charming. So here he was, the king of all he surveyed. he gave himself the title Mummidi Chola, or thrice crowned Chola, the ruler of the Chola lands, the Pandya lands, and the Lanka lands. And much later in his rule, he conquered what they call the old islands of the sea, numbering 12,000, which some scholars say are the Maldives. These were important staging points in the trade routes of the time, and any revenue collected there would now enrich Rajaraja's coffers. Rajaraja had conquered his foes in all directions and pushed the boundaries of the Chola kingdom further than there had ever been. All of peninsular South India was his, and a large part of the island of Sri Lanka. So here is a map showing Rajaraja's kingdom. You can kind of see all this, and the northern part of Sri Lanka came under Rajaraja. So enough of fighting and battles, and let's talk about more peaceful matters now. Before the Cholas came to power, Buddhism and Jainism were popular in the Tamil lands. And then around the 6th or 7th century, something that we call the Bhakti movement, spreading the popular worship of Shiva and Vishnu, spread through the Tamil lands, and it really reached its peak during the 6th to 10th centuries, right before and during the early period of the imperial Cholas. Now you had Shaivite saints that are called the Nayanmars, and many of them were from the Kaveri Delta region, and their beautiful devotional poetry, set right in the bucolic Tamil countryside, spoke to the hearts of the people. And we saw Sangam poetry earlier, how beautiful that was. Sangam poetry is largely secular. The poetry of the Bhakti saints is no less beautiful. It's also very personal. It touches the heart. It's not some esoteric philosophy and high language. It's in everyday Tamil. It talks about everyday things. It can be very, very sensual. It's just an expression of a longing of these people for their God. And I will sing you one line from one of these. Hold on. Sorry. Todudaya Sheviyan, Todudaya Sheviyan, Todudaya Sheviyan, Todudaya Sheviyan, Bidayeriyor tuven Madisudi, Todudaya Sheviyan, Bidayeriyor tuven Madisudi, Todudaya Sheviyan. So that was a description of Shiva. It says his earrings were alluring. He rode a mighty bull, crowned with a crescent moon. He came towards me. And this is by one of the most famous of the Shaiva Bhakti saints, called Tirunjana Sambandar or Sambandar. Now, thanks to this Bhakti movement, the worship of Shiva became very popular in Chola country, and many temples started being built, first of brick, and then later on they were converted into stone. Now, the Shaivite saints wandered around from village to village, singing songs about how they envisioned Shiva in those villages. And again, it's not the Shiva of some distant, faraway Himalaya, but a very local Shiva that could be accessed by the people there. That's why it became so popular. And the imagery is, again, really beautiful. They'll talk about a little blundering buffalo, a coconut falling down on a paddy field, a little egret, hooking its leg, all that fine. So it's rich in imagery of South Indian country, which is why it became so popular, because it really resonated with the people there. And it's kind of funny, because this was when Jainism and Buddhism were being edged aside, and you think of Jnana Sambandar as this, very nice, holy, devout man, but the 11th verse of every one of his poems is reserved for a cutting condemnation of the Jains and Buddhists. It's funny, he said, these base Jain monks with their yellow teeth, and don't trust them. Every one of them will have a verse about the Jains and Buddhists. And here we think of these religions in the most specific of terms, but when they get mixed up with politics and things, they get cast in a very different light. So we're talking about this bhakti movement and the popularity of Shiva because that really permeated the Chola ethos. That became a very important part of their life. And here are some of the earlier Chola temples. They were small ones. As I said, initially they were built out of brick. Later on, they were converted into stone because brick was, a material that fell apart quite easily. These are much more permanent structures. They have inscriptions in them saying, who commissioned the building of these temples and who contributed towards running them. They're really quite charming. And then, again, along comes Rajaraja, who builds his magnum opus that he called the Rajarajeshwaram temple after himself. And it's again a very brilliant strategic move. I'm sure he was a devoted Shiva devotee and very religious and everything. But to me, there was a canny strategy behind building a temple of this magnitude and in the place in which he built it. Because, as I said, he had built his empire on the backs of multiple victories over people who are certainly not happy to be under the Chola crown or the Chola umbrella or something like that. So the seething mass of different tribes who followed different, customs, maybe they spoke different languages, they just were not happy to be under the Chola, emperor. So he had to find a way to make them feel that they belonged to something, bigger, that this was something that they could relate to. And this temple was that. It was built in a place in Tanjavur that had no prior religious association. As I told you earlier, the Bhakti saints traveled from village to village, singing songs, and temples came up in those places. So a lot of those temples had a lot of prior religious association. The Brihadeshwara temple was a blank slate. And it was a blank slate into which he poured masses of money and, all his war booty plus the income from the villages around his land were all put into this temple. And it was a gorgeous temple. As I said, he was a ruler of a kingdom that encompassed a great diversity of people who had never been under one crown before. How do you have to give them something that they can all relate to, and this was this temple. It was completed in a mere 6 years, this temple, from 1004 to 1010. And I think it's ample proof of Rajaraja's remarkable powers of organization and mobilization. Just as Anirudh talked about the Kailasa temple, just think of what it would have taken to build such a colossus in such a short time. Some of the temples in Europe, the Great Cathedral of Pisa, for instance, hadn't even been started then. And even when it was built, it took a few centuries to complete. And here, this one was done in 6 years. So here it is. It's really stunning. It's like, this is the Vimanam, or the tower that stands over the Sanctum Sanctorum. And the first one you see is like an entrance gateway or a gopuram. And you can see the Vimanam behind, and it was surrounded by a wall, and there was a moat in front, and it is believed that the palace and the palace compound were all within this thing. It's huge. You go in there, and you have this impression of immenseness, so as opposed to those little temples that I showed you earlier. They'd never seen anything like this. They say it was the tallest temple in India at that time. And it is built out of granite, which is a material not available in the immediate vicinity. So they must have quarried it from somewhere and either ferried it by boat, by coracle up the Kaveri, or brought on the backs of elephants. 130,000 tons of granite were utilized. They were cut into blocks that are hammer dressed to sit one on top of the other. And I believe there is no cement or stucco or any binding. So it was just the weight of the stones one on top of the other that held the whole structure and ensured stability. Apparently, it was built according to something called the Agama Shastras, which were ancient religious texts that included philosophy, cosmology, epistemology, architecture, and others. And that Vimana that I showed you earlier, that rises to over 200 feet. And there is a theory that there's a ramp that enables the stones to be lifted. Again, obviously, there's no remnant of that. But how, again, you do wonder how they managed to get such heavy materials up such a height. All over the Brihadishwara temple, if you go there, every inch of wall space is covered with carvings and also more fascinating, inscriptions. So he inscribed everything on his walls, so who gave what to the temple. And right in the sanctum, the walls of the sanctum sanctorum are everything that he donated. He donated oodles of cash and jewelry and gold and all sorts of things to the temple. Everything was made a note of. If you read those inscriptions, you know exactly who gave what to the temple and how it was run. And there are carvings all over depicting the multiple forms of Shiva. And most popular, there's one form called Tripurantaka of Shiva, which is Shiva destroying 3 demons with 1 arrow. And as Anirudh said, the choice of imagery is very interesting. So there is a metaphorical component to it, and I'm sure Tripurantaka resonated with them because they had their 3 main enemies at the time were the Pallavas, the Pandyas, the Rashtrakutas, and to show that the god they worshipped did what they did, I think was of great symbolic importance to them. Also, Nataraja, the god of dance, was very, very popular, and it was, if you see these big statues of Nataraja, it was popularized during Chola times. And as I said, there were walls, the walls were inscribed, meticulous details, all sorts of details about how the temple was run. He got 400 women from neighboring temples to work at his temple. We don't know exactly what they did. People say they were dancing women, but I'm not sure. There are theories that say that nowhere does it say that they actually danced, but they were brought and employed and given money to work at the temple. They were given homes at the temple, so the inscriptions give their names, the address, the street name, the street address, all that is there in the inscriptions. Rajaraja poured his resources, his war booty into the temples. Others donated generously. It was a great prestige to be able to donate to this temple, and that was one way, again, he kind of tried to make his large kingdom feel that there was something that connected them all. So here you can see, it's just an example of the inscriptions running on the walls. And it wasn't until the 19th century, actually, that these inscriptions were deciphered. It's interesting, there was a manual written by the British about Tanjavur in the 18-somethings, where they talk about the Brihadishwara. It's mentioned, and they said, I think it was built by a king called Kulotanga. So the memory of Rajaraja had faded, even a few centuries later, that this great king, because a common man didn't read the inscriptions, maybe the Tamil had changed. So it took the work of epigraphists to decipher and find out exactly, because the inscriptions say that who built it and when, and all the information is there. But I found it interesting that that memory had faded just a few centuries later. Here's another example of the inscriptions. And also within the walls of the Vimanam, or the structure over the Sanctum Sanctorum, are these paintings. They look very much like the paintings in Ajanta. So that was probably the style. They're in very, very, very bad shape, and there's a fascinating story of how they were discovered. The one on the left, some people say was Rajaraja and his religious guru. There's, no way of knowing whether that's the truth or not. Some people say no, there are reasons why it's not, but it's just an example of the painting there. And actually the Nayaks who came later, they must have seen these faded, peeling old paintings and said, what is this? So they painted over a lot of the Chola paintings, actually. So the archaeological survey came in. They had a tough job to do, because then the Nayak paintings also are history. So they preserved some of those, and some of this, it's in poor shape, but they had to peel away the Nayak paintings to reveal the Chola paintings underneath. They don't let normal people go, like I try to go and see it, but they don't allow you up there. So it's very, very hard to photograph because it's very dark in there, but they allow a few professional photographers. They don't let them use flash, but at least we got these. So, and these I'm sure are photoshopped and everything. So as I said, the Brihadeshwara, yes, it was a place of worship, but it was also the social and economic and cultural hub of the empire, and its economy was fed by the villages and towns from all over. It was sat on a huge load of cash, which it then loaned out at 12.5 interest rate, further enriching it. And as I said, it was built in a place with no prior association. So it served as a grand unifier, this fantastic, wondrous temple whose workings the whole kingdom was drawn into and invested in. It was a matter of pride to be associated with the temple, I'm assuming. So it was a good strategic move on Rajaraja's part. Now, the Chola temples had a very, very rich ritual life, and part of it was the bronzes that were taken out on display, for the utsavams or the processional festivals. And these bronzes, during the Chola times, the most amazingly beautiful bronzes came into being. Until then, there were small ones being made, and this art actually came into flower during Chola times. And the poems of the Bhakti poets inspired the creation of these stunning bronze images that were taken around in procession. And anybody, the whole kingdom, anybody could go and look at these processions and see their Lord in procession. Many people were not allowed into the temple if they were from the lower caste or whatever it is. It's not much has changed today. But the processions that happened outside were open to anybody. And these were made using what is known as the lost wax method, and it is used to this day in villages and bronze workshops around the Kaveri Delta workshop. So it's a 1,000-year process that remains alive. And the interesting thing is each bronze is unique. Each one is made from scratch. You cannot replicate it. So now the sad part is these bronzes have become so valuable that there's this whole black market and smuggling racket that takes place around them. Original bronzes have been, replicated, and then the fake one is put in the temple, and then the other one is spirited away, and it's part of this black market. They found their way into museums. So that's the dark side of the Chola bronze story, but they are gorgeous. So this is a beautiful, beautiful one of Nataraja, the god of dance. And there were many, 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 many Nataraja sculptures that were commissioned. And this would weigh about 300 to 500 pounds, and you can see there's a hole at the bottom through which, a rod would be put and people would carry it, multiple people would carry it through in procession. And this is what it looked like in procession. It was dressed up and adorned. There would be jewelry, there would be flower, there would be sandalwood, people would be singing and dancing. The processions and the festivals were really colorful things. And many of them happen to this day in villages around the Kaveri Delta. And they sing the songs that were composed by the Bhakti poets, and that is still being done to this day. Now, Anirudh spoke about this as well, but the Cholas were active participants in the trade world of the time. And Chola ports had long been active participants in trade, right from Sangam times. I've told you about the Greek and Roman coins that were found in the Sangam era ports. And in Rajaraja's time, new trade dynamics emerged. You had the Song dynasty in China, the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, and our Cholas in the trade world. In between the Cholas and the Chinese was the Srivijaya kingdom in Indonesia, and they were all locked in pitch struggle for control of trading routes, and China became the most the most desired trading partner. So they're all kind of scrabbling around to get favorable trading rights with China. There was a lot of backstabbing, there was fake friendship. It was all very interesting. And you had these trade guilds that were set up to facilitate the movement of goods within the country and outside. And the Song court in China offered rich benefits to countries that are deemed favored trading partners, which led to feverish jockeying for position and backstabbing, because it meant a rich load of money if you became a favored trading partner. So, of course, Rajaraja had to get in on the action. And his chief rival was the Srivijaya Kingdom, which is a confederation of city-states in today's Indonesia and Malaysia. They were vying with the Cholas for favored trading status with the Chinese. And Rajaraja, of course, could play the double game as well as the best. He pretended to be friends with the Srivijaya while also trying to, backstab and go behind their back to get trading rights. So he sent a trade delegation of 52 people to China by sea, laden with gifts like pearls, rubies, frankincense, perfumes, and elephant trunks. And I found this fascinating. He sent a letter, apparently, in which he said, "I am a small being like a mosquito and a humble creature like a papier-mâché doll, having been living for generations in a barbarous town." Imagine Rajaraja. He called himself Jewel of the Cholas, all sorts of grand titles. And here he's saying, I'm a little mosquito from a barbarous town. So this was from a Chinese account, actually. So whether the Chinese had the last laugh and they made this up, we don't know. Or whether this is how medieval diplomacy worked, this kind of self-effacement, we have no idea. But it's interesting. Anyway, what's that? Exactly. I know. Nothing much has changed. So it took over 1,000 days for Rajaraja's ship trade delegation to reach China. They made several stops along the way, and apparently the delegation was warmly received. But unfortunately, Rajaraja died before his men reached. So I guess he didn't hear about their exploits in the Chinese court. He died in 1014. And the location of his memorial shrine is still uncertain, and there's this whole ridiculous, I don't know what you call it, debate or controversy about his final resting place. So this is a small village in the Kaveri belt called Udayalur, and one day somebody found this half-buried lingam, you can see this here, in a shed that was in the middle of a field. And for some reason they decided this was Rajaraja's resting place. And then there's, of course, huge fervor broke out, and then they put up that statue to him, and then they put, garlands, and people would come and look at it. There was absolutely nothing to prove that, yes, this is his final resting place, or this is where his remains are buried. But then the Archaeological Survey of India said, we will get in on it, we'll do some drone imaging, and we'll excavate and see what can be done, and they promised they would give a report in a few months. This was in 2019, and we have not heard anything, but of course there was the pandemic in between. In the meantime, another scholar has claimed that there is a temple in the same town, but not here, a little away from this little lingam and the shed and everything, and he claims that that is where Rajaraja is buried, and he's given various reasons to bolster his claim. And he has called upon the Archaeological Survey to do their survey of this place. So I think it's very sad. You've seen Humayun's tomb, you've seen, such grand memorial things. And if this is where the great Rajaraja is buried, I think it's very, very sad. So let me just run through to the end of the Chola story, because I think we're running out of time here. Rajaraja's son, Rajendra, succeeded him. He strove to outdo his father, and he succeeded. He sent his people to the north, and apparently they brought boatfuls of Ganga water, with which he built a moat, and he created a new capital called Gange Konda Cholapuram, which means the town of the Chola who brought the Ganga. And he built a new temple there called Gange Konda Cholapuram temple. And I think, Rajendra is portrayed as this very dutiful son who kind of obeyed his father and tried to follow in his footsteps. But the very fact that he created a new capital, built a new temple that rivals Rajaraja's in beauty. It is a little bit smaller, but it is no less stunning. And I told you how much Rajaraja poured into building his temple, how much of money, how much of resources, how much of time. And, and just organizing the whole running of the thing took a tremendous amount of effort. And then Rajendra just comes along and then just pushes it aside, builds his own temple in a few years, and all the money and the resources that were earmarked for his father's temple were now, diverted to his temple. He built, so it's almost like he wanted to completely step out of his father's shadow and make a name for himself. And the things he did were really grandiose. And so he, as I said, he sent his troops into North India and brought back Ganga water. He launched a savage naval raid against the Srivijaya kingdom. And after him came 3 sons, and then the grandson. If you remember, I said Rajaraja got his daughter married to somebody from the Eastern Chalukya. The grandson of that line now became the Chola king after much jockeying for power. And I find this king very interesting, actually, Kulatanga. And he was the longest ruling Chola king. He ruled for 50 years. And he had a court poet who worked hard to kind of bolster his image because he was not a true Chola. His was a maternal link. So he comes up with this very grand poem to kind of show that, yes, he is a Chola, and he's the greatest Chola, and he won all these victories. It's a fascinating poem, actually. Anyway, enemies came and went. The Chola fortunes rose and fell. Several stunning temples were built after Rajaraja and Rajendra. The Airavateshwara temple in Dharasuram and Kampahareshwara temple in Tribhuvanam. And the last known of the Cholas was Rajendra III, who was defeated by who else but the Pandyas. And I'll just show you. This is Rajendra's Gangekonda Cholapuram temple. You can see the Vimanam it's a gentler slope, it's slightly shorter, but it's a really gorgeous, gorgeous temple. And these are the other, what they call the grand living Chola temples, Airavateshwara temple in Dharasuram, built by one Rajaraja II in the 12th century. And here's the Kampahareshwara temple built by the next king. And you see elements of Chalukya style in these, in some of the carvings and the way they went about things. And later on, the Vijayanagara kings would also take some samples from these and incorporate it into their temples. This temple, you can see like a chariot wheel, and the front of it is built like a chariot, and they say that the Sun Temple in Konarak might have taken its inspiration from here. And just a quick run through into what made Rajaraja and the Cholas great. As I said, thinking big, thinking out of the box. Where did he build this temple out of nowhere? Every temple until that point, was it like 2-story little stone structure, and then he builds this colossus, and so he was a great in that way. He was not content to just fight and carry on the legacy and traditions that had gone on before him, but he created something brand new. The importance of a grand unifying symbol, as I said, the Brihadishwara temple. Details. He was meticulous about recording every detail, and the Cholas were some of the greatest inscribers, both in quality and in quantity. I mean, their inscriptions outnumber any other empires, I think. And they also, later on, they started becoming more particular about recording the king's achievements. Of course, there's a lot of hyperbole, but maybe they had a sense of history of recording what happened. Rajaraja was plugged into the wider world. That is, I told you about his trade mission to China. Understanding the importance of organizing and standardizing. I didn't talk about his land organization. He did this big land survey. Every village had a different measurement. Every village was sending different amount of taxes. So he did this big survey to standardize everything to ensure that, tax collection was optimized. Top-notch communications through his inscriptions. They were found all over his kingdom. Image building, projecting an image, whether it was real or not. To some extent, the Chola kings planned their successions. They appointed a Yuvaraja or a crown king. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Utilizing their resources, that is, the Kaveri River was their greatest source of wealth. They dammed it. They built canals and channels to maximize agricultural output. And, people like to talk about what you learn, what lessons do you learn from history. You just see here from Anirudh's presentation and mine, history repeats itself. It's the same story all over again. The cast of characters is different. The way things are done are different. But history repeats itself repeatedly because human nature doesn't change through centuries of history. And it's also in this day when and I think again, we are probably always like to do it. We like to aggrandize somebody, build them up, and it's almost like you caricature them. Rajaraja is this great fellow, and you cannot say anything negative about him, especially in Tamil Nadu, where I'm from, which is, I think, doing him the greatest disservice because you're reducing him to a one-dimensional figure. So life, personality, and history do not operate in binaries. So you have brutality and beauty, generosity and covetousness, because they wanted everybody else's territory, devotion and treachery. They can and do exist in one person. And we need to understand this rather than reduce people into one-dimensional caricatures. I think if anything at all history teaches us, it should be this. And here we are, we come to the end. From 850 to 1279, 4 centuries of glorious Chola history and the sunset on them. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely talk, Kamini, also for the songs that, agams that you sang, along with your segue song by Ilayaraja. Okay, now we are open for questions.
So the early Cholas were probably during the Sangam period, which is, let's say, the 3rd century, it kind of ended. And then the imperial Cholas came in the 9th century.
Yes.
So what actually happened to them in the 600 years? Where did they disappear? Why were they so insignificant in that period? So they were
probably, there's no real record of them. So they were probably there. It's not that one line died out, so they were insignificant. They were just one of many clans that ruled over there. So there's not much record. Like there isn't much record about the other clans that I talked about, the Muttarayars and the Irukavales. This is odd little bits and pieces. So they were probably there, but just not doing very much.
So we don't really have a record of what caused the decline and...
No, there was a lot of fighting. So clearly there might have been one really big battle. So the records from the Sangam Chola are very, very, very spotty. You know, a lot of the sources are this poetry that we see. There are no inscriptions from that age.
Is there a possibility that the Sangam records were retrofitted by the imperial Cholas?
Some of it, yes. I told you the story of Kochengannan, which is it means the king of the red eyes. And they made up a story about him, that he was born as a spider, apparently. And he was a very devoted spider who every day would, weave a special web around the Shivalinga. And then one day he was killed by mistake by an elephant who said, you can't be doing this web thing here. So he was reborn as... Now, when the time came for him to be born, apparently, it was an inauspicious time. So his mother didn't want him to be born at that time, and he was born in Chidambaram, which is another very holy town for the Cholas. Anyway, so the mother suspended herself upside down to delay his birth into the world. So when he was eventually born at a good time, after all, he was born with red eyes because his mother had been upside down, apparently. And that's the story. So all those stories were told later on, you know. So that was, I feel, that must have been retrofitted. Karikala, there are lots of Sangam poems about both Kochengannan and Karikala, but mostly about their battles. But these kind of mythological stories and, you know, making him a spider and all came later. So.
Thank you so much for such a brilliant and an illuminating lecture.
Thank you.
The point you made about the poem, the subtlety of it,
yes,
almost modern sensibility. We encountered this at Tanjore Art Gallery in the Chola bronze of the Bhikshatana Bhairava.
Yes.
Where they've shown a trail, almost like a tear, you know, flowing. Because what Bhikshatana apparently is asking is for people's egos and not actual aims,
yes.
arms, you know.
Yes.
And Dr. Nagaswamy showed us the base in which, where the tear falls, they have installed 2 big pools of moonstone.
My God. Okay. This is in the Tanjore Art Gallery.
Absolutely. It is documented.
Wow.
But see the super sensibility of the artist.
Yes.
And also, we were extremely fortunate to get to see the inside of the Gopuram. At that time, they
I'm
were
so
allowing
jealous. Okay.
And,
so you got to see some of those paintings?
Absolutely, absolutely. And
how did you go up there? Is there
there is a ramp.
Okay.
And there is also a ladder.
Okay.
And at that time I was doing a television program
Okay.
in search of the Chola princess. So the cachet probably helped us. And the image that comes to your mind is that of Agastya somehow. The man who was weighty enough with his knowledge and gravitas to balance the whole of the world at the south.
Yes.
So that is the feeling that you get when you see the grandeur of the Brihadishvara.
Fantastic,
And that was
yeah.
the finale that we used. To get Agastya from the south, being
Yes.
the mentor.
Yes. He was a very important figure in South India and for the Cholas too. They say Agastya is who brought the Kaveri River
Absolutely.
into South India and the Tamil language also. So he's very revered in the Tamil lands. But that's wonderful that you got to see the paintings in the Vimanam.
Yes.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your illumination.
Thank you. Thank you.
In this vast literature, Sangam literature you talked about, I'm given to understand and want to know more. There is somewhere reference to Shavaka, which is
A reference to?
Shavaka. Shavaka, a place which is understood to be Java of Indonesia. And just want to know, because I have no clue about Sangam literature. So if you have, can tell me where it is and in what context?
I cannot answer that question. I don't know this in
All right,
particular.
okay.
But if you Google A.K. Ramanujam, he has translated a lot of the Sangam poetry. Ramanujam, A.K. Ramanujam. Also, there is a website by somebody called Vaidehi Herbert who has translated a whole beautifully, a bunch. She's got her own website. If you just Google Vaidehi Herbert and Sangam poetry, she's translated from Tamil and she's put it all on the web. And it's very nicely catalogued. So perhaps if you search on that, you might find if there's a mention of Java. And I wouldn't be surprised because, there's trade going on in both directions. So I'm not sure what they called it then, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. So, yeah. Yes, of course.
First of all, wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure the portrait of Durga Bai would be very happy to see you here today. And you mentioned about the Chinese trade delegation.
Yes.
Is there any reference to borrowing funds from there or from anywhere else, finance coming from out?
From outside?
Yeah.
Well, the only outside financing was from looting, like from Sri Lanka, that they did send a military expedition there and he looted, as I said, they had these monasteries and the stupas. They just took everything from there and used that to fund the Brihadishvara temple. Rajendra sent a naval expedition to Southeast Asia. It's a misnomer to say he conquered it. It never became a Chola, part of Chola territory. They had their own kings. But there again, he, stole a whole bunch of jewelry and looted that place and brought it back. But it was basically plunder that they brought. The domestic revenue was mostly from, land revenue, taxes, agricultural tax revenues. And trade revenues were they would charge at the ports. Nagapattinam and Mamallapuram were very important ports. So that is another reason why he wanted the trade to go through his ports rather than the ports to the east, the Srivijaya ports, because that would mean a lot of income that would come in that way. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
I had this question, like if the imperial Cholas were so detailed about their inscriptions, and all the records that they have maintained. So is there no record being found for Rajaraja the one's death or where his grave should be?
Yeah, so the death, it just fizzles out. We don't know how he died. He probably did not die in a battle. He was 67 years old when he died. There's a mention of his thing, but nothing about how he died. It's likely he just died a natural death. But yes, this whole mystery of how he died, where he was buried, it's a little sad, which is why I feel there was some kind of a weird, twisted dynamic between him and his son, because it was to have been the son's duty to, build a memorial shrine, and maybe he didn't do it. So, or he did something that was so insignificant. So, there isn't much on that at all. So, Yes.
Thanks for an excellent talk.
Thank you.
How did Tanjore become the capital? I mean, what was it before? Because now, after Rajaraja Chola, we generally believe that Cholas ruled out of Tanjore. But that wasn't the capital prior to that. How did and where was it before? Because when I visited a place called Tiruvarur, I saw a monument for Manunidhi Cholan. And surprisingly today, there is an advertisement in the paper for the sterilized plant.
Okay.
And there also I could see somewhere down, they are talking about Manunidhi Cholan there. So where was the capital? How did the Cholas come about being in Tanjore?
Actually, the Chola capital was at Tanjore only until Rajaraja. So, Tanjore must have been a small town, and it was kind of one of the main towns of a clan called the Muttarayars, that the first imperial Chola, Vijayalaya, he defeated them, and he moved his capital there, and he built this Nishambasudani temple there and everything. So it remained the Chola capital until Rajaraja. And apparently it was a bustling place at that time. And there was an explosion of building when Rajaraja was there. He built a bunch of new streets to house all the temple women that he brought, 400 women that he brought from all over his kingdom. There were lots of people that he brought to, participate in the working of his temple and other parts of his kingdom. There were the palaces. There was like an inner Tanjavur and an outer Tanjavur. We have all that. After Rajendra came, he moved the capital to Gangaikonda Cholapuram, and then Tanjavur just kind of, moved into the shadows. It was nothing. It was later on that the Nayak emperors, they came back and made Tanjavur their capital again. So it was a Chola capital only for a while. Much of the time it was Gangaikonda Cholapuram actually.
I think we can take some more questions offline. Thank you so much, Kamini. That was absolutely delightful. And
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.